The sun hung like a copper penny in the Montana sky, as Tessa Blackburn clutched her still warm wedding ring, now just a circle of gold that meant nothing. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the small homestead as her husband James stormed through their cabin, his voice booming with accusations that cut deeper than any knife could. "You killed him. You weren't watching close enough. Our boy is dead because of you." James bellowed, his face twisted with grief and rage as he swept his arm across the kitchen table, sending plates crashing to the floor. Tessa stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her arms empty of the baby boy who just yesterday had been breathing, smiling, cooing. Little Thomas had been just 6 months old when the fever took him. She had stayed up for 3 nights straight, cooling his forehead, praying, begging God not to take him. But by dawn of the 4th day, he was gone. "James, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I did everything I could." "Everything?" he roared, coming so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Then why is he in a box in the ground instead of in his cradle?" It was 1878, and life in the frontier town of Silver Creek, Montana was already hard enough without the crushing weight of grief that now threatened to pull Tessa under. At 24, she had already buried a baby and was watching her 3-year marriage crumble before her eyes. "I'm leaving," James announced, grabbing his coat. "I can't stay in this house. I can't look at you without seeing what you've done." The door slammed with such force that a picture fell from the wall, their wedding portrait. The glass cracked right between them, a jagged line separating their smiling faces. How fitting, Tessa thought, as she sank to the floor among the broken dishes and broken dreams. For 3 days, Tessa barely moved from the rocking chair beside Thomas's empty cradle. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She simply rocked and cried, clutching the small blue blanket that still carried his scent. James hadn't returned, and part of her hoped he never would. His words had created wounds that felt impossible to heal. On the 4th day, a knock at the door startled her from her grief-induced trance. She ignored it at first, but the knocking persisted, gentle but determined. "Mrs. Blackburn, it's Jackson Reeves from the neighboring ranch. I've brought some supplies. Doc Miller mentioned you might need checking on." Tessa didn't answer, but she heard the door creak open anyway. Heavy boots stepped carefully across the wooden floor until a tall figure appeared in the doorway of the nursery. Jackson Reeves was 30 years old and had worked the land adjacent to the Blackburn property for the past 5 years. He was known throughout Silver Creek as a man of few words but reliable actions. His weathered hat was in his hands now, respectfully removed as he entered her home. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said softly, his deep voice gentle as he took in the state of the room, the broken glass still scattered across the floor, and the hollow-eyed woman in the rocking chair. "I'm sorry about your loss. The whole town is." When Tessa didn't respond, just continued rocking with tears streaming down her face, Jackson didn't press her to speak. Instead, he quietly set about cleaning up the broken dishes and glass. He built a fire in the hearth that had gone cold days ago. He placed a basket of food on the table: bread, preserves, dried meat, and a jar of milk from his own cow. Hours passed in silence as Jackson moved through the small cabin, restoring order to the chaos James had left behind. As darkness fell, he lit the lamps and prepared a simple meal. He placed a bowl of soup and a piece of bread beside Tessa's chair. "You need to eat something," he said. It wasn't a command but a plea. For the first time in days, Tessa looked up and truly saw someone. Jackson's face was kind, his eyes filled with genuine concern rather than judgment. "He blamed me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from days of crying. "James said I killed our son." Jackson kneeled beside her chair, careful to maintain a respectful distance. No mother could have loved a child more than you loved Thomas. Everyone in town knows how devoted you were to him. The fever takes many children out here. It wasn't your fault." The simple words of absolution broke something inside Tessa. The controlled weeping turned into gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Without thinking, she leaned forward, and Jackson caught her in his strong arms. He held her while she cried, not shushing her or telling her to be strong, just letting her release the pain that had been bottled inside. His shirt became wet with her tears, but he didn't move away, didn't try to extract himself from the uncomfortable intimacy of a grieving mother's sorrow. "I tried everything," she sobbed against his shoulder. "I prayed, I made poultices, I cooled his fever, I didn't sleep for 3 nights. Why couldn't I save him? Why did God take my baby? I don't know," Jackson answered honestly. "Some things can't be understood." When Tessa finally exhausted herself, Jackson gently guided her to eat a few spoonfuls of soup before helping her to the bedroom. He pulled a blanket over her and promised to return in the morning, and he did return, every day for a week. Each morning, he would arrive with fresh supplies, food, firewood, sometimes wildflowers that he placed in a jar on the table to bring a touch of life back into the silent home. He never stayed in the house overnight, always returning to his own ranch before dark, mindful of her reputation in the small town where gossip traveled faster than telegrams. On the 5th day, when Tessa finally ventured outside to sit on the porch, Jackson brought her a cup of coffee and sat beside her on the steps. "I lost my sister to the same fever when I was 16, he said quietly, staring out at the rolling hills of Montana. "She was just 4 years old. My ma never recovered from it. She stopped living, just went through the motions until her body finally gave out 2 years later." Tessa looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. His profile was strong, his jaw set in determination, but there was a softness around his eyes that spoke of compassion born from suffering. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said. "And your mother," he nodded. "What I'm trying to say, Mrs. Blackburn, is that grief can either become a grave you climb into while you're still breathing, or it can be a river you have to cross to get to the other side. It's hard either way, but I'd hate to see you follow my ma's path." On the 7th day, James finally returned, stinking of whiskey and self-pity. He found Tessa hanging laundry in the yard while Jackson repaired the broken porch step. "So this is why you haven't come looking for me," James sneered, his bloodshot eyes darting between his wife and the cowboy. "Found yourself company already?" Jackson stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Mr. Blackburn, your wife has been grieving your son. I've just been helping with things around the property." "Helping yourself is more like it," James spat, staggering forward. "Get off my land." "James, stop it," Tessa said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Jackson has been bringing food and fixing what you broke when you left me alone with our dead child." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud. James's face twisted in renewed anger. "You dare speak to me that way? After what you did, after what I did?" Tessa's voice rose, weeks of pain and guilt suddenly transforming into righteous anger. "I was here. I was trying to save our son while you were in town playing cards. I sent for you 3 times before he died, and you didn't come home until it was too late." James lunged forward, his hand raised, but before he could reach Tessa, Jackson stepped between them, catching James's wrist in mid-air. "Don't," Jackson said, the single word carrying the weight of a threat. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, a battle of wills playing out in tense silence. Then James wrenched his arm away and spat on the ground. "Keep her then," he snarled. "I'm done with this place anyway. I'm heading to California. Gold's waiting for me there, and I won't have to look at her face and remember what she cost me." James stomped to the house, emerging minutes later with a packed bag. He climbed onto his horse without a backward glance and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and bitterness in his wake. Tessa watched him go, a mixture of relief and fresh grief washing over her. Her marriage was over. The life she had planned was finished. And yet, standing there in the yard with the laundry flapping in the breeze, she felt the first tentative stirring of something like freedom. "He's not coming back, is he?" she asked quietly. Jackson shook his head. "I don't think so, madam." "Tessa," she corrected him gently. "I think after everything you can call me Tessa." The weeks that followed were filled with quiet, purposeful recovery. Jackson continued to visit, helping Tessa repair the neglected homestead. Together they mended fences, tended the small vegetable garden, and cared for the few animals that remained after James's neglect. The work was healing for Tessa, giving her body purpose while her heart slowly began to mend. The town of Silver Creek watched with curious eyes as the young widow and the solitary rancher formed an unexpected bond. There were whispers. Of course there always were in small towns, but most people respected the tragedy Tessa had endured and recognized Jackson's help for what it was. A neighborly kindness born of compassion. Still, as summer turned to fall, something undeniable began to grow between them. It started with lingering glances, with hands brushing accidentally while passing tools. It bloomed in shared laughter over simple things: a chicken that refused to be caught, the antics of Jackson's dog who had taken to following Tessa wherever she went. One crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Tessa found herself telling Jackson about her life before Montana, about growing up in Missouri as the daughter of a schoolteacher, about her dreams of having a large family, about how she'd met James when he'd come through town working on the railroad. "He was charming then," she said softly, "full of big plans and promises. I thought we'd build something beautiful together." Jackson listened without interrupting, his eyes on the distant horizon. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment. "Dreams change," he finally said. "Sometimes they have to, but that doesn't mean you stop dreaming." In November, the first heavy snow blanketed Silver Creek. Jackson arrived at Tessa's cabin before dawn, concern etched on his face. "There's a blizzard coming," he said without preamble. "A bad one. You can't stay here alone." Tessa looked past him at the thick, gray clouds rolling in from the north, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd heard stories about Montana winters, about people found frozen just steps from their own front doors when blinding snow made it impossible to find the way home. "Where would I go?" she asked. "My place," Jackson answered. "It's sturdier, built against the hillside for protection. I've got supplies enough for months and better shelter for the animals." Tessa hesitated. Going to Jackson's ranch would set tongues wagging even more than they already were. But the alternative was facing the brutal winter alone in a cabin that even in good weather had drafts that made the candles flicker. "I'll pack some things," she decided. Jackson's ranch house was indeed more substantial than her small cabin. Built of thick logs and nestled against a hillside, it was protected from the worst of the winds. Inside, it was surprisingly comfortable, with a large stone fireplace, solid furniture he had crafted himself, and shelves filled with books, a luxury Tessa hadn't expected. "You can take the bedroom," he said, showing her to a clean, simple room with a patchwork quilt on the bed. "I'll sleep by the fire." The blizzard hit that night with a fury that made Tessa grateful for Jackson's foresight. The wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing seeking entry, but inside, they were warm and safe. Jackson cooked a hearty stew while Tessa baked bread in the cast iron oven, the domesticity of the scene striking her with its simple rightness. As they ate by lamplight, snow accumulating outside the windows, Tessa asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Why are you helping me, Jackson?" Truly, he considered her question carefully, stirring his stew with deliberate movements. "At first, it was because no one should be alone with that kind of grief," he said finally. "I know what it does to a person." "And now," she pressed. Jackson looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "Now I can't imagine my days without seeing you." The simple honesty of his words made Tessa's heart flutter in a way she'd thought impossible after all she'd been through. She should have been scandalized by such a declaration. She was still technically a married woman. After all, but instead, she felt a warm glow of possibility. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. The blizzard lasted 3 days, trapping them together in the comfortable isolation of the ranch house. They established an easy routine, caring for the animals in the barn, preparing meals, reading aloud by the fire in the evenings. They talked more in those 3 days than perhaps either had talked in years, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their disappointments. On the 3rd night, as the storm finally began to abate, Tessa awoke to the sound of muffled sobs coming from the main room. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she padded quietly to the doorway to find Jackson sitting before the dying fire, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent grief. Without a word, she crossed to him and sat beside him on the hearth. When he looked up, startled by her presence, she saw the tracks of tears on his weathered face. "My sister would have been 22 today," he explained hoarsely. "I still count the years." Tessa understood then that he had been carrying his own pain all this time, even as he helped her bear hers. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in shared understanding. "Tell me about her," she said. Jackson's smile was sad but genuine. "Her name was Lily. She was the brightest thing in our family, always singing, always finding something to laugh about even when times were hard." They talked until dawn, the first tentative rays of sunlight reflecting off the pristine snow outside as they shared their memories of the ones they had lost. And when the tears came again for both of them, they held each other, offering comfort that went beyond words. When the paths were finally clear enough for travel, Jackson took Tessa back to her cabin. The small house felt colder and emptier than ever after the warmth of his home and his company. "You could stay," he said quietly as he prepared to leave. "Not just because of the weather, you could stay, permanently." Tessa's heart raced at the implication. "Jackson, I'm still married in the eyes of the law and the eyes of God." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I respect that. But James abandoned you. There are laws for that too. You could file for divorce on grounds of desertion." The word divorce hung in the air between them, weighty with societal judgment. Even in the frontier territories, divorce carried a stigma that could follow a woman for life. "I need time to think," Tessa said finally. Jackson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'll still be here." Winter deepened, and Tessa found herself torn between the expectations of society and the longings of her heart. She consulted with the town's preacher and was surprised to find him more understanding than she had anticipated. "God does not intend for wives to be abandoned or mistreated," the elderly minister told her. "The sanctity of marriage is important, but so is your well-being." In February, Tessa received a letter forwarded from a post office in Sacramento. James had filed for divorce himself, citing irreconcilable differences rather than admitting to abandonment. The letter was cold, businesslike, with no mention of their son or their shared grief. He requested nothing from her and offered nothing in return except his signature on the necessary papers. The finality of it brought a fresh wave of grief, not for the loss of James, but for the death of the dreams she'd once harbored. She took the letter to Jackson that evening, seeking comfort in his steady presence. "It's really over," she said, staring into the fire in his hearth. "Everything I thought my life would be." Jackson sat beside her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Endings make room for new beginnings," he said quietly. Tessa turned to look at him, studying the face that had become so dear to her over the past months. "What if I'm afraid to begin again? What if I'm not strong enough?" "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Tessa Blackburn," he said with conviction. "You've survived the worst pain a woman can endure. You've stood on your own 2 feet when it would have been easier to crumble, and you've kept your heart open despite every reason to close it forever." Impulsively, Tessa reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You helped me do all of those things." Jackson turned his head to press a gentle kiss to her palm. "No, I just reminded you of the strength that was already there." The divorce was finalized in April, with the arrival of spring bringing a symbolic new beginning to Tessa's life. The town's initial whispers about her situation had gradually softened as people witnessed her quiet dignity and Jackson's respectful support. Still, they were careful to maintain propriety, Jackson always leaving her cabin before nightfall, their interactions in town appropriately reserved. But privately, their feelings continued to deepen. They spoke of a future together, of building a life on Jackson's ranch, of perhaps someday filling the home with children's laughter again. Yet whenever the conversation turned in that direction, Tessa would grow quiet, a shadow passing over her face. One evening in early May, as they walked along the creek that divided their properties, Tessa finally voiced the fear that had been haunting her. "What if I can't have more children?" she asked abruptly. "What if losing Thomas wasn't just bad luck or God's will, but something wrong with me?" Jackson stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Is that what's been worrying you?" Tessa nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "James said. He said I was barren, that I'd failed as a woman. What if he was right? Would you still want me if I couldn't give you children?" Jackson's face darkened at the mention of James's cruelty, but his voice remained gentle as he took Tessa's hands in his. "I want you, Tessa. You. Not some idea of what our life might look like, not for children you might give me. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to share my days and my thoughts and my heart with you." Tears welled in Tessa's eyes as she finally looked up at him. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since I held you while you cried for your son. I loved you when you were still another man's wife. I'll love you whether we have 10 children or none at all." In that moment, with the creek bubbling beside them and the first wildflowers of spring dotting the banks, Tessa realized that she had been given a second chance at happiness, one she never thought she'd have again after burying her child. "I love you too," she whispered. And for the first time since Thomas's death, the words didn't feel like a betrayal of her grief, but rather like a testament to her healing. Jackson cupped her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her for the first time, a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as Tessa responded with the full measure of feelings she'd been holding back for months. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Jackson pressed his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need protection or because it's expected, but because we belong together." "Yes," Tessa answered without hesitation. "Yes." They were married in June, in a simple ceremony in the town church with most of Silver Creek in attendance. Tessa wore a dress of pale blue rather than white, acknowledging her past while embracing her future. Jackson's eyes never left her face as they spoke their vows, his voice steady and sure as he promised to cherish her all the days of his life. The reception was held at Jackson's ranch, now their ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and lanterns hanging from the branches. There was music and dancing, good food and better company, but the happiest moment for Tessa came when the celebrations were over and they were finally alone. Standing in the bedroom that would now be theirs, Tessa felt a momentary nervousness that quickly dissipated when Jackson took her hands in his. "We have all the time in the world," he assured her, understanding in his eyes. "Nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for." But Tessa was ready to truly begin her new life, ready to claim the happiness she'd thought forever lost. She reached up to unpin her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders in waves of chestnut brown. "I'm not fragile, Jackson," she said softly. "I won't break." Their coming together was tender and unhurried, each touch a revelation, each whispered word of love a healing balm to the wounds of the past. And afterward, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Tessa felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, not the absence of grief, which would always be part of her, but the presence of joy alongside it. Life on the ranch settled into a satisfying rhythm as summer progressed into fall. They worked side by side, expanding the garden, adding new livestock, making plans to build additional rooms onto the house. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains, talking about their day or sometimes just enjoying the comfortable silence between them. On Thomas's birthday in August, Jackson suggested they ride to a special spot he knew, a high meadow filled with wildflowers where they could see for miles in every direction. There, with the vast Montana sky above them, Tessa finally allowed herself to tell Jackson every detail about her son, his dimpled smile, the way his eyes had followed her around the room, how his laugh had been the sweetest sound she'd ever heard. "I think he would have liked you," she said, leaning against Jackson's chest as they sat on a sun-warmed rock. "I would have been proud to know him," Jackson replied, his arms tightening around her. "And I hope he knows that I'm taking care of his mama." That night, as an owl hooted softly outside their window and moonlight spilled across their bed, Tessa whispered a confession to Jackson. "I think I might be pregnant." His eyes widened in the darkness, hope and concern mingling in his expression. "Are you sure?" "Not completely," she admitted. "But I'm late and I feel different, like I did before with Thomas." Jackson pulled her close, his hand tentatively resting on her still flat stomach. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But Tessa, if you are carrying our child, it's a blessing, not a replacement." "No child could ever replace Thomas. He'll always be your firstborn." Tears filled Tessa's eyes at his understanding. "I know. That's why I can welcome this baby with joy instead of guilt, because you understand that my heart is big enough for both." By November, there was no doubt about Tessa's condition. Her dresses needed letting out, and a gentle roundness had appeared where Jackson's hands now lingered each night, feeling for the first fluttering movements of their child. As her body changed, Tessa found herself experiencing both anticipation and fear. The memory of losing Thomas was still raw, and the prospect of another birth brought with it all the dangers that frontier women faced. But Jackson's steadfast support never wavered. He hired a woman from town to help with the heavier chores, insisted Tessa rest when she needed to, and even rode 3 days to bring back a real doctor to check on her progress, rather than relying solely on the local midwife. "You're doing everything right, Doctor," Patterson assured her after examining her in the privacy of their bedroom. "The baby is growing well and you are strong, but childbirth always carries risks, Mrs. Reeves. All we can do is prepare as best we can and pray for a safe delivery." That night, Tessa confessed her deepest fear to Jackson as they lay in bed, his hand protectively covering her growing belly. "I'm terrified of losing this baby too," she whispered. "And I'm afraid of what it might do to us if that happens. I couldn't bear it if you blamed me the way James did." Jackson propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. "Tessa, listen to me. You and I are not James and you. What happened with Thomas was a tragedy, not your failure. If God forbid we face such a loss again, we will grieve together, not turn on each other. But I have faith that this child will be born healthy and strong, just like its mother." As winter settled over Montana once more, bringing with it memories of the blizzard that had first brought them together, Tessa found herself nesting in preparation for the spring baby. She sewed tiny garments, prepared the room that would become the nursery, and listened with amusement as Jackson read aloud from childcare manuals he'd ordered from back east. Christmas came, their first as husband and wife, and they celebrated quietly, exchanging simple gifts and sharing a special meal. Jackson's present to Tessa was a cradle he'd carved himself from a fallen maple tree, its edges smooth and polished, decorated with intricately carved leaves and flowers. "It's beautiful," Tessa breathed, running her fingers over the detailed workmanship. "I started it the day you told me you might be expecting," he admitted. "I worked on it every evening while you were asleep. I wanted it to be perfect." Tessa's gift to him was a handmade quilt she'd secretly pieced together over the past months, each square representing something from their life together: a horse for the ranch, a sunrise for new beginnings, intertwined rings for their marriage, and in the center, a single star for the child they had lost and the one they were waiting to welcome. "So we never forget where we've been," she explained as Jackson traced the stitching with reverent fingers, "or how far we've come to find each other." As January turned to February, and February to March, Tessa grew increasingly uncomfortable but also increasingly confident. This pregnancy felt different from her first, stronger, somehow more firmly rooted. The baby moved constantly, kicking and shifting as if impatient to enter the world. "This one's going to be a handful," the midwife chuckled during a checkup. "Active babies are healthy babies." On a blustery day in early April, with the first signs of spring just beginning to emerge from beneath the winter snow, Tessa felt the first contraction while gathering eggs from the henhouse. She calmly finished her task, placed the eggs in the kitchen, and then went to find Jackson, who was repairing a fence in the north pasture. "It's time," she told him, a mixture of excitement and apprehension in her voice. Jackson's response was immediate and focused. He helped her back to the house, sent a ranch hand to fetch both the doctor and the midwife, and then set about preparing everything they had discussed for this moment: heating water, gathering clean linens, making Tessa as comfortable as possible in their bedroom. The labor progressed steadily throughout the day and into the evening. Unlike with Thomas, where she had been largely alone until the final hours, this time Tessa had both Jackson and Mrs. Porter, the experienced midwife, attending her from the start. When the pain became intense, Jackson held her hand, wiped her brow, and murmured encouragement in her ear. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he reminded her as she gripped his hand through a particularly difficult contraction. "You can do this. We're going to meet our baby soon. Doctor." Patterson arrived just as the labor entered its final stage, bringing with him the reassurance of medical training that had been absent during Tessa's first birth. With his calm direction and Mrs. Porter's practical experience, Tessa felt supported in a way she hadn't before. As midnight approached, the moment finally came to push. Jackson positioned himself behind Tessa, supporting her back as she bore down with all her strength, her determination fueled by both love for the child she was bringing into the world and the memory of the one she had lost. "I can see the head," Dr. Patterson announced. "One more push, Mrs. Reeves." With a final, tremendous effort, Tessa felt the baby slip from her body, and then the most beautiful sound filled the room, the strong, indignant cry of a newborn taking its first breath. "You have a son, Mrs. Porter declared, her weathered face breaking into a broad smile as she quickly wrapped the squalling infant in a clean blanket. Tears streamed down Tessa's face as the midwife placed the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair like Jackson's, and when he briefly opened his eyes, she glimpsed a hint of her own hazel color. "He's perfect," she whispered, counting fingers and toes, running a gentle finger over the soft curve of his cheek. Jackson leaned forward to look at his son, his own eyes swimming with tears of joy and wonder. "Hello, little man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been waiting for you." For a long moment, they simply gazed at their child, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Then Tessa looked up at her husband, love overflowing in her heart. "What shall we call him?" she asked softly. Jackson considered the tiny face, now calming as the baby nestled against his mother's warmth. "What about William, after my father?" "William Jackson Reeves." Tessa tried the name, feeling its rightness. "I love it." As dawn broke over the mountains, bringing with it the promise of a new day, Tessa watched her husband cradle their son beside the window, his large hands infinitely gentle as he pointed out the first rays of sunlight. "That's the sun, William," he was explaining seriously, as if the newborn could understand every word. "It rises every morning to remind us that no matter how dark the night, light always returns, just like you came to us after a very dark time." Watching them, Tessa felt a completeness she had thought forever lost to her. The pain of losing Thomas would always be part of her, a shadow in her heart, but it no longer defined her. In its place was a new understanding of the preciousness of life, the beauty of second chances, and the healing power of love freely given and gratefully received. "I never thought I could be this happy again," she said when Jackson returned to the bed, carefully placing William in the cradle beside them. "You deserve every happiness," Jackson replied, settling beside her and drawing her into his arms. "And I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." As spring bloomed into summer, baby William thrived. He grew strong on his mother's milk, his cheeks rounded, his eyes bright and curious about the world around him. Unlike Thomas, who had been a quiet, contemplative baby, William was boisterous and demanding, making his needs known with lusty cries that could be heard across the ranch. "He has his father's determination," Tessa would laugh as Jackson paced the floor with him at night. "And his mother's spirit," Jackson would counter with a smile. The ranch prospered along with their family. Jackson's careful management and forward-thinking investments had expanded their holdings, and by William's first birthday, they were considered one of the more successful operations in the county. They hired additional hands to help with the increasing workload, built a larger barn for the growing herd, and even added a proper nursery onto the main house. Life wasn't without its challenges. There was a drought the summer William turned 2 that threatened their crops and tested their resilience. There was a winter so harsh when he was 3 that they lost some livestock, despite their best efforts to protect the animals. But through it all, Jackson and Tessa faced each difficulty together, their partnership strengthened by the trials they'd already overcome. When William was 4, Tessa discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than her previous ones, her body seeming to remember the way of things. her mind less shadowed by fear now that she had the living proof of William that happy outcomes were possible. In the spring of 1884, Elizabeth Ann Reeves joined their family, a delicate, fair-haired daughter who looked at the world with her father's thoughtful blue eyes and her mother's determined chin. "She's going to be a heartbreaker," Mrs. Porter declared as she helped with the delivery, which had been blessedly quick and uncomplicated. William was fascinated by his baby sister, peering into her cradle with solemn curiosity, bringing her his favorite toys even though she was far too young to play with them. "Gentle son," Jackson would remind him, showing him how to softly touch Elizabeth's tiny fingers and downy hair. As their children grew, Tessa often thought about how different their lives might have been if tragedy hadn't altered their paths. If Thomas had lived, she would likely still be with James, trapped in a marriage that had already begun to sour before their son's death brought its fatal fracture. She would never have known the deep, sustaining love she shared with Jackson, never experienced the joy of raising William and Elizabeth in a home filled with laughter and mutual respect. Sometimes the thought made her feel guilty that her current happiness had been built on the foundation of her greatest sorrow. But Jackson, with his quiet wisdom, helped her see it differently. "We honor Thomas by living fully," he told her one evening as they watched their children playing in the yard. "By being the kind of parents he deserved, by loving each other, by making something good from the pain we've both endured." As the years passed, their family continued to grow not just with the addition of another son, Matthew, born when Elizabeth was 3, but with the extended family of ranch hands, neighbors, and friends who found in the Reeves household a place of warmth and welcome. Their home became a gathering spot for community celebrations, a refuge for those in need, and a landmark of stability in the ever-evolving frontier. Tessa never forgot Thomas. On his birthday each year, she would take a small blue flower to the cemetery where he was buried, spending a quiet moment remembering the brief life that had changed hers so profoundly. Sometimes Jackson would accompany her, sometimes she would go alone, but he always understood her need to maintain that connection to her firstborn child. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching their 3 children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, William, now a lanky 10-year-old, Elizabeth a spirited 6, and Matthew a rambunctious 3, Jackson took Tessa's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. Tessa nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "From the darkest days of my life to this. Sometimes I can hardly believe it's real." "It's real," Jackson assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every bit of it." As the children's laughter floated on the warm evening air, Tessa reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. From the devastating loss of her baby and the cruel abandonment by her first husband, through the days of tears and grief when Jackson had held her without judgment, to the slow, steady rebuilding of her heart and life with a man who loved her completely. It had been a path marked by both profound sorrow and unexpected joy. "I wouldn't change it," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the realization. "Not if it meant not having this, not having you and our children." Jackson's arm tightened around her shoulders, understanding the weight of her words. "I wouldn't change it either," he said softly. "Though I would spare you the pain if I could. I know you would. That's why I love you." As darkness settled over the Montana landscape, stars appearing one by one in the vast sky above their home, Tessa thought about the strange, winding path of fate that had brought her to this place of peace. How a heart broken beyond repair had somehow found not just healing but expansion, growing large enough to hold both the memory of what was lost and the treasure of what was found. "Mama, look," William called, his cupped hands glowing with the light of a captured firefly. "I caught the brightest one. It's beautiful, darling," Tessa called back, then whispered to Jackson, "just like our life." Jackson's answering smile held all the love and understanding that had been the foundation of their years together. "Even more beautiful tomorrow," he promised. And every day after that. And as their children raced back to show them their glowing prizes, Tessa knew with absolute certainty that he was right. The path ahead would have its own challenges and sorrows. Life always did, but they would face them together. Their love strengthened by the trials they had already overcome. Their family bonded by both blood and choice. In the end, what had started with holding her while she cried had become a lifetime of holding each other through everything that came after: the tears and the laughter, the struggles and the triumphs, the ordinary days and the extraordinary moments that, woven together, created the rich tapestry of their shared life on the Montana frontier. And it was more than enough. It was everything.